Thank you, Paul, for that. Can you hear me? Yeah? In the back? Cheaper seats? Yeah? We are indeed very pleased to be here today. And very pleased to be co-hosting with the Brookings Institution. This event is a month in the making. And I'm also happy that 8 transatlantic flights later, our colleagues from Africa are also here safely. It's no coincidence that we sequence this conversation on human rights, environment, and conflict first. For us, for Oxfam, we see these issues, these two panels, as interconnected. Human rights impact, environmental impacts, communities' right to decide if and how a project goes forward, interconnected with issues around revenue, understanding how much money is coming in, how much money should be coming in from extraction projects, and how these revenues are invested in pro-poor development. But whereas the public discourse on East Africa's oil boom is largely centered around the ease and speed at which these resources are coming to market, to Asia, to India, to China, and how revenues will be generated, and in some instances, borrowing and spending against future revenues that at the very least are 7 or 8 years down the line. For us, this conversation must start at the beginning of the project cycle. Ensuring that communities are properly consulted, that they can give or withhold consent for a project without coercion, that this is done throughout the life of the project, not just during the EIA process, that both men and women equally partake in decision-making processes. Issues around resettlement, environmental impacts, compensation, land titling. We know that if we don't get this right at the beginning, this will only result in or exacerbate conflict. And at the crux of this is governance, good governance. And good governance is not just about technical capacity, the savvy, but it's about political will. The political will to ensure that citizens' rights are protected, that the revenues will benefit the entire country, not just a few in power. So joining us today, my esteemed panelist is Ikal Anjali. She's the Executive Director of Friends of Lake Turkana in Kenya. Bennett Freeman, who is Senior President for Calvert Asset Management and is a trustee with the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Emily Greenspan, who is Senior Policy Advisor for Oxfam America. Peter Veit, who is Acting Director for Governance, Center of Excellence at World Resources Institute. And Sandy Stesh, who is Vice President of Safety, Sustainability, and External Affairs at Tullow. And I've been asked to be very strict about your time, 70 minutes, so that we can have enough time for conversation. So with that, thank you so much for being here. And Ikal, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ikal Anjali. I am the Director of Friends of Lake Turkana. We are a community trust in the Turkana Basin who focuses on natural resource and environmental justice. Our biggest mission is to ensure socioeconomic and environmental justice for local communities. Turkana is in the northwestern part of Kenya. We border southern Sudan, southern Ethiopia, and parts of Uganda. It's a dry area, mainly known for its drought. It makes the international media for drought, famine, and sometimes conflict. 2010, for the first time, we started being known for oil finds. And it brought a lot of expectations, as is rightly it should, in an area that has suffered marginalization for years by the central government. We are now enjoying a different sense of interest. We have a 4% women literacy level. We have a 94% poverty level. We have an 87% illiteracy level. So the sort of environment where this oil has been found is rare, where communities being part of the decision-making process is a little different, where the information they have is very little in comparison to what central government knows. So one of the people who are working, the companies working in the region is Tullow in the oil exploration. We have the EHRC, and we have CEPSA, which is a Spanish company linked to Total. all doing the exploration, but now Tullow is the big company because a lot of its finds are commercially viable. We are struggling with sort of a system of governance that's moving from a centralized system to a devolved system of government. We just passed, we got a new constitution in 2010, and so grappling with the implementation of these legislations. The land that is being explored, so while the oil it belongs to government, the land that the oil is on is community land. Unfortunately, it is one of the legislations that has not been passed into an act. So we're grappling with the fact that how is work going on land that has no legislation that governs the land? And this, I think, is a quagmire that both local communities are suffering from. So it's an issue within national government. These are the sort of problems in terms of whether compensation, if the land that Tullow is working on is destroyed for one reason or another, a spill, grazing lands is taken from local communities. How are we going to deal with the compensation angle when we do not have legislation that governs the same land? So we're struggling with that. As I said earlier, it's an area where there's conflict. Information from government trickles down very slowly and sometimes does not get to local communities, which creates environment for conflict. And as I said, an area where we have access to arms in the region, it creates a space. We need to start working towards a space where the conversation is had, not only on a national level, but allows inclusivity of the local communities. We've seen this in Nigeria, where local communities who felt excluded from the conversation really have nothing to lose, and they're the people who would then create the conflict. And this is a conversation that has to be had. It does not need to be had by government bringing security personnel to secure the oil wells. The government of Kenya has not given security to the local communities in the region. But now with oil, the government of Kenya is giving security to the oil companies. What does that say for the citizens in the region? It means that you're not entitled to security, but the oil wells are entitled to security. And this is something that is critical and has to be discussed at a national and at a local level. Again, issues around revenue. Right now, we have nothing concrete that indicates how much revenue goes to national government and how much goes to the local communities and to the local government. We're struggling with that because the local communities are feeling that we've been detached from government. So we always made the joke that we're coming from Turkana and going to Kenya. And for this local community, for us to say it's a national asset, it is time that a deliberate effort is made to bring the local communities in the Turkana region to the level that they feel they're on the same playing field as the rest of the country. For you to ask them that there is need so revenues have to be shown to really go to make a deliberate effort to increase their livelihoods. As I said, with a 94 to 97% poverty level and 87% illiteracy level, how do you expect such communities to say we are on the same playing field? How do you expect them to feel that this is a national resource when for years that there's never been a national resource that has been brought to bring some social economic transformation to these communities? So for me, as a representative of the local community, I think it is time that the companies working in the region have to recognize that the political economy of the region is different. We're not on the same playing field. So what national government perceives is not what the local community perceives. And it is time to make sure that they get it right. We cannot continuously put ourselves behind government has said. No, the national government may have said, but you're working within a region where communities need to be part of the conversation, and they have to be on the table. So companies have to push for the local community's inclusivity on the discussion table and not just always hide behind the barriers of the national government has said. Thank you.
Thank you, Ikal. Bennett?
Thank you, Maria, and good morning. Thank you very much both to Oxfam and to Brookings for convening this timely conference today. As Maria alluded in her introduction of me, along with the other panelists, I'll speak briefly from two perspectives. First, from my day job with Calvert Investments, and secondly, as a trustee and director of the Institute for Human Rights and Business in connection with the Nairobi process that our organization has gotten underway in recent months. First, from the Calvert perspective, I want to be very clear that we're all here focusing on the development of oil and gas resources in East Africa because we share a desire to see the people of those countries, not just the governments, not just the oil companies, the people of those countries escape the resource curse, which has been such a plague to not only other countries in Africa, but to all too many countries elsewhere around the world. And certainly there are important lessons to learn, but also a range of players who have interests at stake here. And while it is absolutely appropriate that NGOs led under the umbrella of the Publish What You Pay Coalition have led the charge here for revenue transparency, whether through multi-stakeholder initiatives like EITI, legislation such as Dodd-Frank 1504 and its counterparts in Europe, we hope Canada and elsewhere, that investors, responsible investors, also share a stake in the prudent and transparent, accountable management of these oil and gas resources. That's why Calvert has seized the chance the last several years to mobilize a broad and deep-based coalition of investors of all sizes and shapes, and not just based in the United States and not just traditional so-called sustainable and responsible investors, to support Dodd-Frank 1504. And the reason is not just that we care about East Africa and other countries escaping, avoiding, if possible, the resource curse, but because we see material interests at stake in the disclosure of the data that we're going to be getting sooner rather than later, we hope here, in terms of what companies are doing with those revenue payments, those taxes, those royalties, signing bonuses, and so forth. They will give us a absolutely critical insight into the political, legal, reputational, and operational risks that companies in which we invest or may choose to invest or not will be dealing with, have to be dealing with in the context of both established and new emerging oil and gas ventures alike. So that's why responsible investors have planted our flag together with NGOs internationally, CSOs, regionally and locally on behalf of revenue transparency and accountability. And that's where the Institute for Human Rights and Business comes in. While lending support to transparent and accountable revenue management and the role and voice of local communities in Kenya in particular, the Institute has set up the Nairobi process with local NGO and CSO partners to take a rights-based approach to the development of these oil and gas resources in Kenya in particular. And the hope, the expectation, the imperative is that Kenya can become a model among East African countries to take a rights-based approach and avoid some of the excesses here that have been all too apparent elsewhere in Africa and around the world. And so the Institute has been putting forward a series of internationally agreed human rights principles, the guiding principles on UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and other standards such as the voluntary principles on security and human rights as templates to help guide government at different levels in Kenya, to help give a template to NGOs and CSOs, local communities, to hold the government and companies accountable for how security forces may be deployed and may operate. And Ikal made, the most incisive point 5 minutes ago that it is absolutely critical that security focus not just on oil and gas installations, not just security for the companies, but first and foremost and fundamentally for local communities. And the Institute is working very hard to develop awareness of the voluntary principles and their operational utility for companies, communities, government, and security forces alike. Also, at the same time, working with local communities and NGOs at the national level on other difficult issues that come into play here, like, for example, land rights. So we're very hopeful at the Institute that we can play a role here working with in-country NGOs and CSOs to help ensure that there's this rights-based approach as inevitable conflicts arise as Kenya's oil and gas resources are developed. Let me just close with a theme that I think is just critically important here, which is not only the diversity of interests at stake here, whether for local communities, civil society, governments, companies, investors, but the absolute imperative of finding points of convergence, of converging interests among the actors, and a willingness to come together and to find points of consensus, even in the context of inevitable conflict, that will lead us to the same goal. And that goal is for East Africa, Kenya, the other countries of the region, Uganda, Tanzania, to try to escape this curse. We share a stake. Let's find those points of convergence, even amidst the conflict. And I really look forward to the discussion on the panel and the rest of the day to hear how we're going to do it together. Thank you.
Thanks, Bennett. Emily?
Thanks, Maria. So as Maria mentioned, I work on Oxfam America's extractive industries team, and I lead our research on issues of local community participation in decision-making around oil, gas, and mining projects. And this is an issue I've been working on for about 10 years now, beginning in Peru, looking at issues of consultation with indigenous communities around hydrocarbon blocks in the Amazon. And you know, one issue in particular that I focus on quite a bit is the issue of free, prior, and informed consent, which we really see as the gold standard for community engagement and participation around extractive projects. So what is free, prior, informed consent, or FPIC? It's the idea that indigenous and local communities must be adequately informed about extractive projects in a timely manner, and importantly, given the opportunity to approve or reject these projects prior to the commencement of operations. This is not a one-off process, as Maria mentioned at the beginning. It applies to every phase of project development. And Oxfam has just produced a paper, which is available to all of you here, with the Center for Public Interest Law in Ghana, which looks at FPIC in the African context. And one thing that I think is really exciting and interesting about looking at this issue in the African context is that, you know, we've seen the issue talked about in Latin America and other regions for decades in the context of the indigenous rights movement. And as Oxfam, we recognize that FPIC is protected in law, in international law for indigenous communities. But we're also seeing that it's emerging in Africa as a standard for all extractive industry projects, regardless of the type of community that's impacted. And one of the key things that I've noted in the last few years and highlighted in the paper is that we're seeing regional institutions in Africa embracing the concept and talking about it as applicable to all local communities. So just a few examples. The Economic Community of West African States issued a mining directive, which actually applies to both the mining and the oil sector, in 2009. And this directive provides principles for harmonizing mining regulatory regimes in West Africa. And it is binding on states. They issued this directive in 2009. And there's an important article which actually calls on states to ensure that companies obtain FPIC pre-exploration and prior to each subsequent phase of mining and post-mining operations. We also saw in 2012 statements from both the Pan-African Parliament and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights calling on states to ensure FPIC in decision-making around natural resource projects. And then finally, the African Mining Vision, although the report itself that came out in 2009 talks about participation of communities more broadly, when we see in 2011 the implementation action plan for the vision, there is a specific reference to states ensuring protocols to protect FPIC. So this is something that's been kind of exciting and interesting for me, seeing the initial background coming from indigenous rights and seeing the concept owned differently in the African context. I also think, you know, another point that we talk about it in the paper is that, you know, companies are recognizing that there's a business case for consent, that there's a way, as a way to mitigate risk of social conflicts around projects. And companies that don't enable communities to participate in decision-making face real commercial risks, as Bennett was noting. And this is not a new phenomenon in Africa. We've seen in Nigeria that they lost up to 800,000 barrels a day as a result of violence and conflict in the Niger Delta. That was in 2005. We saw that Tello experienced a stoppage just in October of last year as a result of local protests. We also saw last year in Mtwara, Tanzania, local protests and violence around the location of a gas processing facility. So this is something that companies, I think, are quite aware of. And I wanted to also note that Oxfam, actually in 2012, we issued a report that's called the Community Consent Index. And this is a report that, this is the second version of the report, which will be updated next year, looking at company positions on this issue and where are companies standing. And we've seen that out of the 28 oil, gas, and mining companies that we reviewed, 20 have publicly incorporated, either directly or indirectly, general concepts of either FPIC, the idea of community support of projects, or the idea that companies need a social license to operate. We saw 5 companies that have explicit FPIC policies, and we saw an additional 8 that had either indirect or qualified commitments. So for example, a company might say that they have adopted an approach consistent with international standards which outline consent principles. So there is some movement, and we're hoping that we'll see much more of that next year. I think companies are beginning to understand the business case. And so, finally, just a couple of suggestions. I think, first for companies, that companies should be aware that this FPIC trend is coming, that it's different the way that Africa is looking at it. And if they want to get ahead of the curve, that they should start putting these FPIC policies into place now and starting to discuss and really think through implementation strategies for how to make this work. I also think, donors should raise this issue with governments and encourage them to take concrete actions to enshrine FPIC in their national laws. This is both, for the protection of human rights in the context of oil development, and also to promote a stable operating environment. And I think that we are seeing examples like Kenya, where there's real live opportunities now, a lot of legislation being discussed, and I hope that we'll be able to take advantage of that and ensure that FPIC is protected in the new legislation.
Thanks, Emily. Peter?
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank Oxfam and Brookings for the opportunity to speak. I'm delighted to be here. I've been given 5 minutes. I've been given 7 minutes. Oh, great. WRI works on safeguards because we think safeguards are an important and useful tool for addressing social and environmentally related conflicts. We work on a small number of safeguards, and given the attention and the expertise that's here on the panel as well as in the room on transparency issues, what I thought I'd do is focus a little bit of attention on land safeguards. It's an issue that is that many of the panelists have already talked about, but I think it might be useful to add a little bit more information on that. So I've got 7 minutes. I want to make 4 points. The first is that the international safeguards, the international norms around land rights are rapidly changing. We have very strong World Bank safeguards on land. We have very strong IFC performance standards on land, but particularly focused around compensation issues. They are very weak on land rights. And so there is a movement right now to try to reform those safeguards, to try to strengthen community land rights specifically. And I want to put a shout out to the FAO voluntary guidelines that were passed in 2012. Those are rapidly becoming norms. They talk about legitimate tenure holders. And I think those, coupled with the interest of developing a land target in the post-2015 MDGs, might provide some additional momentum to reform the international safeguard standards. So that's the first point. The second point is that of these 3 countries, or the 4 countries in East Africa, the land laws are actually quite good. If you look at Mozambique, Tanzania, Uganda, they are 3 out of the 7 countries in all of Africa that recognize fully customary tenure arrangements without them having to be registered and formalized by the state. That's very unique in Africa. We have a community land rights bill that's being discussed in Parliament. We'll have to wait to see what that looks like in Kenya, but we're very optimistic that will be quite strong as well. So we work in an area where the land laws are quite strong. If you look at the petroleum bills, however, my third point is we have much more. We have a bit of a problem with the petroleum laws with regard to land rights. If you read, for example, the 2 petroleum bills that were recently passed in Uganda, they subordinate community land rights to petroleum rights. And let me give you some examples of this. Emily was talking about FPIC. FPIC in Uganda is only for used and occupied land. It's the land that's actually is homestead. It's the land that's farmed. It's not the common property, that area that is not considered used and occupied by many countries in Africa. If communities want to build, or if an individual wants to erect a building on his land, he now has to get written approval from companies in order to erect a building on or a structure on his property. He's allowed, or she's allowed, to use their land, farming and agriculture, but only insofar as it doesn't interfere with petroleum operations. Now, all of that, of course, is necessary for petroleum rights to be exercised. But I think the balance between petroleum rights and land rights is not quite there, and the subordination of land rights is a particularly important issue. The fourth and last point I wanted to make is to talk a little bit about the practice around land rights. And here again we have some problems of implementation. So that partly there's a contradiction between some of the laws in the East African countries, but also we have a real challenge around practice. And let me focus on 2 issues here, and I'll finish up. We know land values are increasing in the oil areas significantly and within months at a time. The number of land transactions that are taking place in the oil regions in all of these countries in East Africa is skyrocketing. And it's usually resulting in local people losing their land and elites taking that land. Now, all of this is under the guise of willing seller, willing buyer, but it's hardly willing seller, willing buyer in the way that we know it. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of concern about whether you're going to get any compensation whatsoever for the land. So there's a real need to look at how these land transactions take place, how to create transparency around these land transactions, and how to ensure effective compensation. The last point I wanted to make is just about a point that Godber talked to me about just a couple of days ago, and that is land is being expropriated for pipelines and for refineries, for example, in Uganda. Compensation is based not so much on market value, it's based on government-valued land. And a lot of times there's a real delay in when compensation is paid. And in that period of time, land values increase. So the amount of compensation that is provided the landholders is significantly lower than market value. So we have a lot of challenges with regard to land issues. And let me finish there.
Thanks, Peter. And last but not least, Sandy.
Yes. Thank you. I'd like to also thank Brookings and Oxfam for the invitation. I'm actually fairly new to both Tullow Oil and Sub-Saharan Africa, and I've been with the company just at about 3 months. And sort of specifically brought in to take a new position that had not existed before in Tullow, at least at the level that I was brought in at, and that is to cover safety, sustainability, and external affairs issues for the company. I think importantly, and I think it says something about the company, brought in at a very, very senior level to provide not only the support to the business, but the challenge when needed inside the company. I was actually pretty thoughtful in deciding what I was going to do next. And I will tell you, it was not only the strategy of Tullow Oil that attracted me to the company, but also its values. And I think specifically, and there's been a lot said on it already, the position that the company took on transparency, I think, was both right and bold. And it gave me the confidence to take the role that I did with the company. To be clear, and I think I echo a lot of what the other panelists have already said, we do not underestimate the challenges of the success that we've had in East Africa, and I think specifically and recently in Kenya. And as I sort of enter my new role, I come at it with just a couple of general themes, and I think maybe a number of other panelists have also shared these. And the first is I come at it with a general theme that the discussions that we have need to be multilateral. And Bennett, I quite liked your point about points of convergence because I think there's something critical and thematically in the way the company needs to approach our business generally, but also specifically the challenges in East Africa. Secondly, on the ground, yes, there is a need to, I've oftentimes heard it say, educate or explain our business to the people that we're impacting. But I think there's, secondly, and more importantly, a need to engage. And I think that's actually a really important distinction that I oftentimes point out to my colleagues, which is educate and explain is kind of one direction, engage is two direction. And I think, again, particularly as we expand our business, that is going to be critical to our ability to be successful. Thirdly, in a general theme, it isn't, and it's interesting in our business, when you shift from exploration to development, and the Kenya, and particularly in the Turkana region of Kenya, there is a potential for a large development in a place that is very, very remote. There needs to be, I think, a shift also in the company from a lack of a better word, sort of a cost of doing model, to cost of doing business model to one more of long-term investment. And that's certainly, and by that I mean not only financially, but long-term investment in the mutual benefit that this industry can and should bring to the region. Specifically, and I will be anxious to have further discussions, not just in this panel, but longer term with everyone on, as we look at Kenya, our footprint is increasing. And as our footprint increases, our engagement needs to increase. And we have a clear understanding that needs to be at all levels of government. And I know even just in some brief conversations I had with some of the panelists, I think we need to be thoughtful that include all stakeholders in society, including civil society and women, actually. And I think I learned a few things yesterday, actually. Thank you, Akal, for some missings that we may have in our current engagement approach. Secondly, we need to do the traditional social investment, but we also need to look at investment in the longer term. And I think it starts to get at some of the harder subjects. And Peter, you sort of inferred, I think, one of them, which is the impacts on people and land. And I'll add water management, I think, is going to be a critical issue for us in Kenya. And I think we need to think of that in the broadest possible terms. And finally, and I think equally importantly, and we've certainly seen this in sort of our early days of expanding our opportunities in Turkana, we do need to help with building capacity. And we've had some, I think, and by the way, this is both in capacity building for local businesses that can benefit from our activities, and also from the people the local people that will ultimately be the employees for the expansion activity. And I think we've had some good experiences in Ghana, and I think we need to be thoughtful and figure out how to transplant some of the successes and some of the learnings to our activities in Kenya. So I'll close with that and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Sandy. So I will use my moderator privilege and ask a few questions before opening it up to you. Ikal, you mentioned the issue of security and how government is providing security to companies, not to communities. Bennett, you mentioned the voluntary principles. The voluntary principles are, of course, voluntary. They're not binding. So how do we ensure that companies are compliant with the VPs? How do we give confidence to communities in Turkana and elsewhere that they will be compliant?
Okay, thank you. I was involved in the development of the voluntary principles on behalf of the State Department at the end of the Clinton administration, and I think it's fair to say that there still is not full transparency and accountability around company implementation of the voluntary principles, despite some considerable progress and efforts the last several years in particular. The voluntary principles are governed through a plenary internationally, and it will probably take a couple of more years for there to be sufficient progress here on transparency and reporting. That said, and this is really my key point, both given my perspective on the VPs, but also the Institute on Human Rights and Business's point, is that nonetheless, there is immediate scope right now on the ground in Kenya for implementation of the VPs, and there should be a expectation on the part of local communities, CSOs, NGOs, that companies, and not to put Sandy on the spot, but companies obviously, including Tullow, should be not only implementing the voluntary principles, but also consulting with local communities and the government as they do so, and also finding a way to report on them. And I can tell you that just because there isn't any mandatory reporting of the implementation of the voluntary principles at the global level doesn't mean that a number of companies haven't reported on implementation through their operations globally and on the national and even sometimes local levels. So I would put to the side the problems in the voluntary principles process globally and focus on what we can do immediately now in Kenya on the ground and elsewhere in East Africa and around the world, and look to Tullow, I hope, to take some leadership here.
Just to add on to that, a lot of the times when we have engaged in the oil issues, the discussion has been that the agreement is between Tullow and the government. And I think Tullow has a stake to actually put it forward to government that it is government's responsibility to provide security for its people. Whether we are having conflicts on raids between tribal communities, that is one part, but it is the responsibility and obligation of the government to provide security for its people. A lot of the times now we're seeing not only are the official security personnel being taken up by the companies, but also local police reservists actually being again pulled in by companies. So company being able to discuss with government and saying if Tullow in this case should actually put it as leverage to government and say, as we are engaging, as we would like to do business, we would like to make sure that among the issues, social issues that we're dealing with, that there is sufficient security around, not only for us, but for also the residents of the region.
Sandy, did you want to comment on that?
I mean, it was actually a conversation that came up at our board a couple of months ago in voluntary principle, and I guess what I can offer is this is particularly in the Kenya context, a conversation we should continue, because we and I think someone referenced it earlier, had an incident and continue to manage some smaller, lesser incidents, but incidents nonetheless. And I think it's just a conversation that we should continue to have to get it right, because we are a signator to the voluntary principles, and clearly we want to be sure we're connecting all the dots there in the Turkana region. So I would offer that.
Emily, so you talked about community consultation, community consent, and for East Africa, and certainly for Africa as a whole, there are lots of lessons to be drawn, particularly from Latin America. So I wondered if you could comment on that, on implementing FPIC.
Yeah, great. And also one thing I should have mentioned too, to be sure that I don't paint too rosy a picture talking about company commitments to FPIC and our community consent index. There's still quite a long way to go in terms of implementation. And I wish I had more positive examples to draw from the African experience about implementation of FPIC. But one that really struck me, and one that we've actually documented in a report that Oxfam put out, From Controversy to Consensus in 2012, is a consultation process that was implemented by the Ministry of Hydrocarbons in Bolivia. I think that's quite interesting because ideally it should be the government that's implementing these processes. I wouldn't say it's by no means too late once the company comes in, but the earlier the better. Even pre-bidding process would be the ideal. In this context, the block was a hydrocarbon block on indigenous lands in Bolivia that was going to be impacting Guarani communities. And one thing that was quite interesting is the consultation process did not get off to a good start. There was quite a bit of resistance from communities. But the thing that I think was positive about the experience is that the ministry was quite open to their suggestions. So, for example, the community came back and said, these maps are out of date. We need more updated information. They wanted an adjusted timeline. They said in order to be able to, the Guarani leaders, in order to have time to go back to their grassroots communities and appropriately engage with them, they needed a new timeline. And they wanted to do a field inspection with the government. So they wanted to be sure that they were able to take government representatives and show them areas of particular socio-environmental, that were particularly sensitive in social or environmental conditions. So I think one thing that was to the government's credit is that they adopted the new timeline and they responded to each of these demands, and they were able to reach written agreements, and they've been able to uphold those agreements. And it hasn't been an always smooth and perfect road, but the consultation and engagement continues, and the agreements are still binding in Bolivia. This was in just a few years back in 2010. So I think it's a good example of how things might actually go forward.
Thanks. Do you want to comment on that? So Peter, you mentioned this issue of subordination of land rights, contradiction of laws. There's certainly a sequencing issue in East Africa, in that on the one hand we have questions about the regulations, legislation, and on the other one, operations are moving forward. To put it in a context, in Mozambique, the World Bank approved last year a $50 million technical assistance loan to strengthen government capacity to manage the sector. This in the context of concessions being doled out without a national cadastre, issues around resettlement, compensation, questions about the legality of the land title given to in the north to the new LNG project that's being planned. So given the sequencing challenge, what's the lesson for donors and for operators?
Thanks. So one point I think that is worth repeating, and that is that in Mozambique and Tanzania and Uganda, customary land rights are recognized without registration, without getting a certificate. You don't need a piece of paper to claim the rights to your land. So it's a default position, essentially. One of the interesting things about much of Africa, which I think differs with Latin America and Asia, is that there are a systematic separation of property rights regimes between land and high-value natural resources. Now, around the world, subsurface natural resources are usually severed from land rights. But in Africa, it goes even further, and they sever surface natural resource rights as well. So you have a really complicated, overlapping land and natural resource rights regime. So you can have a community can have rights, trophy hunting concession can be put on that, a logging concession could be put on that, a mining concession could be put on that, a petroleum concession could be put on that. So it creates these huge, complicated, overlapping land and natural resource rights, which the laws do not address very carefully and very effectively. But they do create a hierarchy. And it's pretty consistent with the value of the natural resource. And it is pretty consistent that they all subordinate community land rights, despite the recognition in law for customary tenure arrangements. So that's, I think, a really important point to make. The other point that I'd like to make then is that part of the problem, of course, is that we don't have cadastrals in a lot of countries. Land administrations are incredibly weak around Africa. I think in part that's done. Excuse me? I'll let you say it. Done for lots of reasons, I think. This is increasingly a problem for a lot of companies. Companies rely on governments of providing them land that is vacant, idle, and unclaimed. Well, there's no such thing as vacant, unclaimed, idle land in Africa. All land is claimed, right? So as communities recognize their land rights, as communities take action on their land rights, the cost to companies of dealing with contested land is skyrocketing. So no company wants contested land. What I think is really needed, and we're working with a number of land rights organizations right now, to create a global platform on community land rights. And think of it as a first-order title search. So a company can look to see whether, in fact, the land that's being offered to them by governments is indeed uncontested. So it's we hope a real opportunity for companies and to go into the negotiations with governments and have a better understanding of who claims that land.
Thanks, Peter. So Sandy, I'm glad you mentioned women and extraction. We know that the impacts of extraction are gendered, that because of the roles in the household and the communities, women bear the brunt of the social and environmental impacts and certainly sexual exploitation. Is this something that Tullow is looking at in its operations?
I mean, clearly it's, we're involved in very active engagement with communities. And I think specifically, hopefully answering your question, but I think my learning in some conversations over the last couple of days, and this is going to sound pretty simple, but you know, I think something we need to be more thoughtful about is in those engagements, making sure that we're doing them at a time of day that women can participate, and if need, culturally parallel to some of the conversations we're having with the leaders of the community. So, you know, I think, I mean, clearly our outreach and our engagement needs to be very broad, and I think we need to, you know, again, with advice from many of you, figure out the best way to do that, to be sure that we're actively engaging with women.
We're happy to help. Okay, on that note, we will open it up to questions from the audience. We'll take 3 at a time. And I'm wondering, are there any government representatives here today? Okay, we'll take questions from you. Okay, we'll start here and here. This lady right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Kea, and I'm from Kenya. I think the issue that I would like to touch on is what I think Emily has suggested, FPEC. I think you'd agree with me. This particular proposal is anchored on international law, and international law tend to be don't have, you know, in most cases, what you call legal penetration. But I was suggesting that that could be complemented with what we call the Aboriginal Title Doctrine. What that says is that the fact that the land was taken or colonized, the Aboriginal title still hold. It is a common law doctrine, and I know, like in Kenya, our court has entertained So I would suggest somehow maybe also need to invest on that, and maybe land in Turkana, that issue can be raised. Because what's going to happen, I think I was talking to Inka, is that this community land, it used to be trust land that was held by the local government on trust. I mean, on the behalf of the resident. But then in Kenya we haven't defined what resident means, because I can move from one location and move to Turkana, and obviously I'll be part of that ownership, and basically that is already happening. So I would suggest that this FPAC should be combined with these doctors. It's very difficult to do it, and I know Aboriginal. There's a huge or a lot of jurisprudence that are done in Australia, called the Mambo case, where the indigenous in Australia were able to really get their land rights. I know South Africa has really entertained it, but I know in Kenya, for specifically, our court has entered it because there was a case that was brought on by Ogiek, and the court said that they would entertain those, these Aboriginal title doctrine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm a president of a profit and a non-profit organization called Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on conflict resolution and violence prevention. I'm from Kenya, but I'm based here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for Brooklyn Institute and for your wonderful speeches, especially Sandy mentioning women. What I wanted to give an idea, not an idea, is since we focus on conflicts and resolution, all the companies are going there for minerals, to extract, to get money, or to make money. Looking at the local people, how do you empower them? Do basic things for these people: clinics, schools, women access to power, to cook with power. African women have carried firewood on their heads. What are you going to do with these people on the ground? Are you just going to make money and get out, or just people fight? And because at the end of the day, when conflicts and violence come, you will be the victims. So how do we make this not happen? The young people who are the victims, you need to empower them, create jobs for them, make them a livelihood in those countries you are extracting minerals. This is their land. Don't ask what will the government do, and you found people living there. You need to make a change into their lives. Coming to the profit, I'm a profit company. So I focus and work with small and medium companies. How do you work with small and local businesses in Kenya to make money too, to make their life, not only you to make money and get out of there? You need to work with civil society, small businesses. So how do we collaborate with you people? Thank you so much, Sandy, for women are part of my heart since I was born and raised in Africa. They need empowerment. They need a life to live. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks. Richard Downey from Center for Strategic and International Studies. It seems one of the big problems is that in communities that where the big discoveries of oil and gas take place is managing the wholly unrealistic expectations of communities who expect a bonanza tomorrow when, as we know, the revenues are perhaps not so immediate at all. Interested in the panel's perspectives on how those expectations can be managed, maybe from government side, from companies, and also civil society and communities themselves.
So thanks for that question. I fully agree. FPIC, it's an international concept. It's a process, but it very much needs to be owned and incorporated in national legislation in the way that's most appropriate for that particular context. And I think, it's interesting to think, I think I mentioned earlier in terms of jurisprudence, that is where the legal protections lie is for Aboriginal Indigenous communities. So, whether it be national laws in the Northern Territory of Australia, or whether it, or the Philippines, or whether it be in sort of international protections like findings of the Inter-American Court Commission of Human Rights, or, cases in Kenya, actually the Endroy case. All of those findings were specifically linked to Indigenous rights. And even the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, when they made their decision in 2009 on the Endroy, a community that had been displaced from a natural protected area, And in that finding, they did make a specific reference to FPIC, but it was really based on the findings of the Inter-American, sort of drawing from the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and talking about the Ndoroi as peoples, indigenous peoples. And I think there's an interesting question there in Kenya of how, now that there is so much legislation being discussed, how does the country want to think about those protections? Because one route would be to go for the indigenous protections. You could think of the Turkana as indigenous. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has labeled the Turkana as indigenous, but there's a lot of questions there in terms of, is that the way the Turkana want to be viewed? The question of, self-identification, marginalization, land dependence from an international standpoint, then that might be one way to go. But another, there might be another approach that civil society and communities feel we want something that goes farther than that even. We want to say in our national laws, we want something that protects all communities that are affected by oil and mining projects. And I think that's why, I thought it was important to mention some of the international standards and policies that are coming out in the African context, because that's where we're seeing that go. But these are, political and difficult questions that the country will have to grapple with.
Which question? So, this issue of indigenous territories is an interesting one in Africa. So the kinds of international protections afforded to indigenous people is separate and distinct from the rights that communities that are not indigenous hold. There's this distinction in international law between indigenous people and communities, which I think is a bit of a problem, because who is indigenous in Africa? I would argue that many people are indigenous in Africa. And so I understand why indigenous people in Latin America want to maintain the distinction between them and other communities, but it is a real problem in Africa. Because I believe that communities don't get the added protections they ought to in a lot of cases. I am following with great interest the Community Land Rights Bill that we have the November of last year draft that we've been reviewing. And what's interesting in Kenya is that when you passed your new Constitution, which was very progressive on land rights, immediately a whole series of laws were passed consistent with the Constitution, except the Community Lands Bill, which is this transformation of trust land to community lands. And I think I'm nervous what the implications of this pause is. And so I think there is a real need to try to make that law consistent with the principles that have guided community land rights in the other countries in East Africa. Let me just say one other point regarding expectations maybe a little bit, and benefit sharing, and maybe the implications for CSR. CSR is not the in my opinion, CSR is not what communities should be spending their time focusing on. It delegitimizes the state. All of these companies pay huge royalties and fees and taxes. And I recall the debate and the discussion that's been taking place in Uganda about revenue sharing. And most of the oil areas is in the Bonyoro area, and they initially, I think, asked for 50%. So that was pretty clear early on that no cultural institution was going to get 50% of the revenue. And I think the public finance bill now calls for 7% of the royalties to go to oil-producing local governments. That's interesting, but it's unclear how that's going to be passed down. In Nigeria, there's a 13% derivation that goes to the governors straight off the top. and it hasn't resulted, as everybody knows, in a lot. Interesting, if you look at the mineral law in Uganda, it says landholders get 3% of the royalties. Not local governments, but landholders get 3% of the royalties, which is making a connection then between the land rights and mineral rights. It would be nice to see something like that in the petroleum bill. Thank you.
We are years down the road from seeing any other revenues from this project. So on this issue of managing expectations, if anybody else wants to comment?
I would, but Ikal might have even more a more genuine perspective. If you want to go first.
The reality is, on the ground, as I said, rightly so, after the announcement, everybody expects. I mean, one of the proposals on the table is 30,000 shillings per household per month. Again, a lot of it is, I blame it both on company and government, because they raised the expectations. The announcements made within the basin was, the Lokichar Basin is just one basin. It's not the entire Turkana. That announcement made, of course, some people look at share price, some people look at how the news is hitting the internet. I mean, everybody these days, even herdsmen, have cell phones which have access to internet. And so they see this information, and it really creates this sense of big stuff coming to them. So when a government official is saying this land is going to be transformed in the next 5 years, land speculation is going on. So areas that ideally were, you'd get land just to graze, no one cared about the cost, and now going for 200,000 Kenya shillings for a 50 by 50 piece of land. So you're seeing this, and so it is a responsibility of government, but I guess it's something that the companies have to make realistic. I understand it's a business, and you have to make your shareholders happy, but again, the impacts will come down to governments and again going down to the rest. And in terms of, again, I echo with Peter the discussions around CSR via CSI. On a personal note, we've seen this where government stops its role. We had drought in Turkana last few weeks. Tallo gave out 20 million shillings. Is it Tallo's business to give 20 million shillings for feeding programs in a country? Or is it government's role to take care of the preparedness of a drought system? So again, as companies look for social contracts, are we going over and beyond and making government, taking away the responsibility of government from taking care of its citizens? It's a big discussion that has to be had between CSR versus community social investment that looks at the long term of communities.
Yeah. I would add a couple points. I mean, first, this theme of government versus company roles is so important, and it's finally now coming into focus. And I've been among those, among many others who for a number of years have looked to companies to play larger roles together with government and civil society in addressing a lot of the sustainable development and human rights issues. But that said, we've gotten to the point now where too often companies are the default key that we press to solve every problem. I've really felt that at the risk of putting forward a theorem, that demands for corporate responsibility tend to rise in inverse proportion to government irresponsibility. And we've really got to redress that balance. Now, in terms of the expectations issue, and Peter appropriately alluded to Nigeria, where any of us who've been to the Delta know that there's no more dramatic and tragic example in Africa, or for that matter, the world, of dashed expectations. My view, and again, I'm far less interested in my view than Ikal's view and those of you from East Africa, but for what it's worth, based on some experience working with different actors, governments, NGOs, companies, investors, that if there's any key, and there really isn't, but if there's anything approaching a key to managing expectations, it's transparency. And particularly transparency in this case not only around land rights and acquisition, but also transparency around revenue management and ultimately distribution itself. Not to put too much weight on the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the EITI, but it has been playing an increasingly important role in a number of countries in Africa and elsewhere in mobilizing civil society as part of its multi-stakeholder process to ensure that kind of transparency. I had the chance just 2 weeks ago to meet with the head of the EITI Secretariat in Monrovia and was very encouraged by his and his team's efforts in Liberia to bring about that kind of transparency through engagement of local communities and civil society in that country that itself is now beginning to look to the prospect of some oil revenues that are beginning to come in. So if there's any solution, I think it's that, and it's the kind of transparency, though, that has to be coupled by leadership from government, not just companies, leadership by government to say, we're going to be transparent in the revenues we're going to receive. We expect companies reciprocally to be transparent in the revenues that they pay, and that there will be a role, a big voice for civil society at the table, whether through the EITI process, through representative democracy, through parliament, and in determining ultimately where those revenues are going to go. I think that's our best, not our only hope, but our best hope. But it's going to take leadership by government to ensure that kind of transparency, to manage expectations for the long run.
All right, the age of technology, we have a question from Twitter, from Shakunti. Good governance and transparency are essential. Do we really believe this can be achieved before the extraction frenzy begins? I'll let you marinate on that. So we'll take a couple more audience questions, succinct, please. Over there, over here, and sorry, over here, Alda.
Thank you. My name is Alda Salomão from Mozambique. I work for the Center for Environmental Research and Advocacy. And I have a question for Peter and Sandy. I was pleased to hear that Peter is working now on a governance center for excellence. And I'm wondering what that is and what are you really trying to achieve, because for us, many of the problems that we are facing are related to governance. So I would like to hear your comments about that. My organization is monitoring the licensing process of the Anadarko gas project in Palma, Cabo Delgado, northern of Mozambique. And we are also providing the affected communities with legal assistance. And what we have realized is that despite being a country where the legal framework is famous for being good, and we would expect that these resources would form a basis for the country to jump up from its poverty position. What we see is that we have a public-private consortium against the rights and interests of communities. The company and the government have joined hands and closed their land deal over to occupy over 25,000 hectares of land for the infrastructures related to the LNG project. So my question is, what are the windows of hope that we have to really see good governance taking place if everything that we have until now is not necessary, is not sufficient to ensure that? Is there any space for the business sector to really comply with the international and legal norms related to social and environmental responsibility? And is there any space for our governments to really conduct themselves in accordance with the principles of good governance. Thank you.
Okay, another light question. Michael?
Thank you. Michael Jarvis, Governance for Extractives team at the World Bank Institute. I just wanted to pick up on Bennett and Erkil's comments on, I fully agree that transparency is sort of the starting point, and from the licensing through to the contracting to the revenues and even how those revenues are spent. But really, it seems to me the heart of what the issues of this panel are addressing are process and how you get that right. And my worry is that too much of it from voluntary principles, etc., are either at the global level or maybe trickling down to national level, say through an MSG of EITI. But really, we're not getting these processes happening effectively, engaging local government in, say, the Turkana region. I wonder if any have thoughts on processes they are seeing where that is maybe happening to a more sub-regional or local level, and how we can try and build that into across these countries for East Africa. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one final question. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Alfred Nam from Uganda Embassy in Washington. My apologies for Ambassador Woneka, who could not join us at this session. Mine is just a comment about the land issues. I've had comments about complexities of the land, legalities of ownership, values attached to it, resettlement issues. Those just indicate to you how land in Africa is complex. So as we mention efforts which are underway, we should really also appreciate what governments are doing to accord the communities that are affected by these discoveries. I think it's only fair that we go into detail, because mentioning it here and just discussing it as if it is a passing item is really not giving it enough attention. I also had a representative of TALO made quite a number of comments on Kenya. Of course, Kenya has made discoveries, and we appreciate it's a sister country. But I would have loved to hear more of the experiences of TALO in Uganda, where they have been for more years, and they have confronted land issues, they have confronted issues of social investment, they have been confronted for a number of years, and I wanted to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, who wants to start?
So, boy, these are simple questions. So, WRI, our governance center, has focused its attention on two sets of rights. We focus on procedural rights, and in particular the rights that are codified in Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, which are the rights of access to information, the rights of access to participation, and the rights of access to justice. We deal with other issues, but we think those are important, particularly important, so we focused our attention on that. And we spent a lot of time on comprehensive issues such as national FOIAs or Freedom of Information Acts, but we also spend a lot of time thinking about transparency provisions in sectoral laws, whether they're petroleum laws or forestry laws or whatever. Uganda has a FOIA from 2005, I believe. It's some of the provisions, I think, in the petroleum bill contradict it, but we'll see. There are some cases in court right now as well. I did want to make one point, though, and WRI has a history of working with civil society, and we spend quite a bit of time helping and supporting public interest law groups, and it's great to see a number of groups here that are sort of fit that bill. But I worry, and I want to maybe come back to some of the things that Bennett said. I worry that we put too much focus and too much hope on citizens and civil society organizations to holding the state accountable. they're just one set of actors, and they can only do so much. And people talk a lot about public participation, but you can't really scale public participation. You can't really scale and institutionalize public participation. Where do you see a direct democracy? You don't. I, for example, think we should be spending more of our time working with the parliaments, making sure MPs perform their fundamental representation roles, which they don't. Why don't we spend more time thinking about how the electoral laws push MPs to be beholden to political parties rather than to their own constituents? That's a way to institutionalize public participation. So I think it's not to argue that public participation isn't important, but in a functioning democracy, public participation is really important for minority positions, usually. Right? So I think there are ways that we need to think more creatively about how to push for fundamental democratic principles beyond just issues of public participation and citizen engagement, because there are limitations to that. So let me just stop there.
Please. Yeah.
Look, I agree that civil society participation is difficult to scale. I nonetheless think it's absolutely critically important, particularly at the local community, regional level, in a region like Turkana, where the resources are actually being developed. That said, there are some emerging examples, if not models yet, of developing the political will and the institutional capacity of legislators in Africa and elsewhere around the world to deal with these very issues. That's been a focus of one of the organizations I've also been involved with, namely the Revenue Watch Institute, which has been undertaking over the years some training programs on exactly these issues with legislators as to the mechanics, economics, politics, if you will, as well, of revenue transparency and management. So we need to move down that road as well. I don't think it's a choice of one or the other. I think we need both the civil society participation and, frankly, mobilization, but also building that political will and institutional capacity for legislators and representative government as a whole.
Okay.
Just to add on to what Peter was saying, I think and Sandy may agree with me, Leslie is over there, looking at the Kenyan context, our legislators, the focus has been on things they know: revenue, employment, and personal contracts that benefit them, because they don't understand anything else. They don't understand the impact on land. They don't understand how much water is going to be needed to actually extract the oil. They don't understand the impacts on the environment. And so, the processes, as the World Bank Institute had mentioned, it's how do you also give them that institutional capacity so that they can engage in the processes? Because if they don't understand the processes, trust me, when the energy bill goes into Parliament, they're going to pass it if they're not going to be, if they will be absent from Parliament. That's another thing. They may be absent because they don't understand the context as to what they're going to be discussing. So there is need, as we engage in Parliament, to actually give them the context of the natural resources that they're talking about, because the only three things they were going to mention is revenue, contracts for themselves to benefit, and employment for the local community, because that's all they know.
Tanya, did you want to?
I mean, just and Carl said, we understand that it is more complicated than that, and but as a private company, it's important that we engage on all levels. So I think we just need to be part of that conversation to make it clear that there are issues broader than than what may immediately be taken up by Parliament.
Okay, we'll take one more closing question from the audience, and so you better make it good. Lady in the
Well, thank you very much for that pressure. Channing May from Global Financial Integrity, and I'm just curious about your thoughts. Recently, the OECD has passed their country-by-country tax reporting, we've talked a lot about transparency. Do you think this is going to have an effect, not so much on the countries that we've been discussing, but more on the oil companies and requiring more transparency in their dealings in the countries?
So we'll look at the issue of contract transparency certainly in the second panel.
Yeah, okay.
So maybe we'll just hold that question for the second panel, and maybe the lady right behind you. Here's your chance.
Wow, yeah, pressure. Okay, my name's Lean DeBrucker. I work with Global Rights in the Natural Resources and Human Rights Program. One of our country offices is in Uganda. And so I just came back from a 2-week trip there. And what struck me, and what we haven't really touched on here, is that in general, the speed at which the government wants the oil out, which is yesterday, they want this quicker, faster, and cheaper. And there's a struggle both within, whether you talk to ministries in Kampala or the local government, or if you even talk to the oil companies themselves. And I had the privilege of speaking with, your colleagues at Tullow. But there is just there's a gap. There's a serious gap between what we're talking about here and between the commercial drivers of the industry. And so I really would love to hear a bit about how do we bring this discussion into that commercial discussion. You can speak with people at the Ministry of Finance who look as if I have two heads when I speak about social conflict having an impact on their bottom line. You can speak with people at Tullow, a pretty senior manager who sits there and says, wow, I'm so glad you came here because you know what? You should really speak with the head of Tullow here. And you can tell them just how important these social issues are. Yeah, and great, okay, we'll have a chat with him. We'd love to help you. But, until we really bring this conversation into the business conversation, until we have some very clear ideas to say, dear government, if we can't actually register the land that the companies need to enter construction next year in Uganda, then we have a big problem on our hands. You have one woman in Kampala who registers titles. If you look at the number of titles that will need to be registered, and that one woman, she can't do everything. And maybe actually, you don't even have, you have a shell of local government that doesn't have the capacity to do what it needs to do. You have land rights that, yes, okay, maybe in theory, you don't need to register customary land, but the Tullow stakeholder engagement people, they have to walk up to people and they say, yes, dear sir, we know you have lived on this land for generations and generations, but...
I think we hear you.
Yeah.
Absolutely hear you. And I will just add to that, to the inherent power dynamics within government and within, for example, the Ministry of Environment vis-a-vis the Ministry of Petroleum. So comments on that?
There is pressure in the system to move quickly, without a doubt, and trust me, that's something that is a very regular conversation inside the company. And I actually think there's probably something this industry can learn from mining in this regard, because I do think, and I think that's been a shift, certainly in the 20 or so years I've been doing this. To sort of build some of that into the front end. But that's not something that a company can do, any one company or the industry can do unilaterally. And I think it is something that we need to work with government and civil society to be sure that we're building in the front end. Because at the end of the day, the value from these projects will not be extracted if we run into problems that we could have otherwise mitigated just for taking our time. So I think it's just something we need to continue to talk about.
Absolutely. Anybody else?
Maybe I'll just note also that there's a section in the Africa FPIC report that talks just about this. And for civil society groups, the idea of this report was really to provide a tool for civil society groups that want to advocate to their governments or companies on these issues. And so we have a section. There's been quite a few studies, quantitative studies recently coming out documenting the costs of social conflict. It's a bit trendy. But if you need some data points, we have some of that in the report and some citations that will hopefully be useful for advocacy.
Okay, on that note, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your questions.